All right, so happy to be here. I'm going to be talking about how GraphQL is accelerating product and data delivery. I'll get into that in a bit. Quick introductions. Like Marian said, I am Tanmai. I'm the CEO co-founder at Hasura. Hasura is an open source infrastructure startup. We help people get production-ready GraphQL quickly. I am super excited and happy to be here because till about 2 years ago, I used to be a massive GraphQL skeptic. That's my skeptic face. I also had a lot more hair. And I think that's an appropriate metaphor for me converting into a GraphQL believer, but also losing a lot of my hair with GraphQL implementation. And that is going to be largely the theme that you're going to see with GraphQL. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how GraphQL is helping us reduce time to market and get stuff done faster. And I'm going to talk about 3 kinds of use cases with GraphQL, right? So there's a client-centric use case, there's a platform-centric use case, and there's a data-centric use case. And these are kind of like actually API use cases. And we're going to look at GraphQL in these use cases. I'm going to talk about what GraphQL brings to these use cases, what its benefits are, and what the current challenges on each of these 3 fronts are, right? So before we dive into that, let's quickly take a recap at GraphQL 2019. GraphQL has been growing fairly steadily since its launch 5 years ago. Very large, positive, vocal community, which is great. That's my obligatory Google Trends slide. Every December, I don't know what happens, but people just stop searching for GraphQL, presumably because they're on vacation. But GraphQL is also heavily in demand, which has been a theme over the last few years. And so that's a popular JavaScript survey that's usually with JavaScript developers, has a large number of front-end developers. So the stats are a little bit kind of around that ecosystem. But over last year, a lot of people wanted to use GraphQL. Not a significant chunk had gotten their hands dirty with GraphQL. But there's a much larger kind of set of people who definitely want to use it. And this number is obviously continuously changing. So hopefully we'll see a big shift this year. What was also really nice last year was the formation of the GraphQL Foundation, which brought together some of the early adopters and the early kind of vendors in the ecosystem, which has been great. And the GraphQL Foundation is kind of helping manage the spec, various GraphQL core projects, the vendor ecosystem itself, and kind of helping grow the community, right? So the GraphQL Foundation is kind of part of the same large umbrella organization that has CNCF and Linux Foundation, stuff like that. So that's been great as well, and that's a good thing for our community. So kind of diving deep into the different use cases. So we'll start off with the client-centric use case. So the client-centric use case is kind of the bread and butter use case of GraphQL. It's kind of where everything began, which was the idea. So a client in this case is a mobile app or a web app that is making API calls to do stuff. The biggest problem that GraphQL helps solve, and talking about the problem a little bit, is that API integration is kind of this irritating process that that slows delivery, right? That slows our ability to build products. And this is a little bit painful for several reasons. I'm going to talk about 3 specific things, right? As an application developer, as somebody building applications, the bit in the application where I have to actually wire up the APIs is kind of my least favorite part of building the application, right? It's like I built the product, the UX is great, and then I have to actually get to the API integration. So for example, the first problem that I would run into there is, how do I explore the API? Where is the documentation? Is the documentation nice? Has somebody shared it on a Google Sheet? Has somebody shared it? Is there a Swagger spec for it? Where is it? And is it documented? Is it up to date? And that's kind of a common problem that developers or application developers face. The other problem is that for common use cases, for use cases that you shouldn't have to need to talk to a backend developer for, you have to talk to the API development team to kind of help you get product. And then the third use case is that as client-side applications become large and complicated, the amount of effort required upfront in kind of optimizing the data fetching and the API fetching logic, and that optimization starts becoming quite complex. It's a significant amount of overhead to deal with. It's something that you might not notice in a small app, But in a large application, you'll notice you're spending a lot of developer cycles kind of just doing that optimization, right? So I'm going to take a few examples, and I'm going to talk about what GraphQL has that helps us solve these problems, right? So exploring the API, and this is something that most of you would have seen, which is table stakes, which is graphical, right? And this is a really simple thing that has just been a massive game changer for anybody using an API, right? Because before this, I would have to kind of go find the docs wherever they are, copy, paste, try something out, right? And having GraphQL is the equivalent of having like a good IDE for your API. So it's like saying that you have autocomplete and IntelliSense for your API. And this might seem trivial, but I think this is one of the best things about GraphQL that immediately stands out, right? Even if you're talking to somebody that doesn't know GraphQL and you kind of show them this thing, they instantly get GraphQL and they get why I should even think about trying GraphQL out. I remember reading the GraphQL spec many years ago, and I was like, this yuck, cannot deal with this. It's too much. And then I looked at GraphQL and I was like, I see, I want to use this, right? And that's kind of the experience that it has for developers. And at the heart of this, and the reason why this is possible for every single GraphQL server without any extra effort is because of a nice feature that GraphQL has, which is the ability to introspect, right? So this introspectability is kind of is a rising theme that you'll see across the industry, right? And this ability to kind of introspect a server, to fetch from the server itself what fields are accessible, what types are accessible, what operations you can do, is a game changer and has resulted in the creation of like a lot of tooling. And that we're going to see over the next 2 days that makes GraphQL super accessible, right? Right, block-on API developers. So how many of us are backend API developers? Cool. I hate you folks because every time I get to because it's like simple things. For example, there are a bunch of API endpoints. I'm building a profile page or whatever, right? And there are 10 API calls, and I just want one, and just give me one API. And the amount of effort that you have to go through to talk to an API developer, and they'll be like, oh, but I'm on a break, I'm taking a vacation, do you really need this API? I mean, the data is all there, why don't you just make 10 API calls or whatever, right? Is painful, right? There's no new work happening. All of the business logic and everything is already done. It's just for some reason, it's painful to kind of use this. And this is kind of just nice with GraphQL because you're like, oh, here's my GraphQL query, right? And here, what is nice about GraphQL and the idea of GraphQL is the graph part of GraphQL, right? Which is this ability to kind of model almost any kind of API or any kind of like API that you would see that serves JSON, I mean, not binary data and stuff, in a graph-like structure, right? And a graph-like structure turns out to be like one of the most like kind of real-world practical ways of modeling, the way things are and the way relationships are. I mean, technically, even if you don't have any relationships, it's like a graph with just top-level nodes, the useless graph. But still, I mean, this aspect of GraphQL and elevating that as a first-class kind of thing that developers see and use is a very key property of GraphQL that has kind of made it successful in a way that its predecessors weren't, right? And it's also kind of the syntax of it, right? Which looks like this is the JSON that I want, and this is the shape of the JSON that I want. So it's nice, it's convenient, that syntax really helps. And that goes a long way in making GraphQL accessible and solving problems for people who are kind of building things and building applications. One of the things that starts showing up at significant scale or complexity is that the logic that is required to kind of optimize data fetching, right? So on the left here, I have an app, right? It's an outline. But this app kind of has many components, and we're going to fetch data for this, right? So you have different components in the app, and so you have, let's say, this kind of root blue component, and then you have a component inside it that has its own data requirements, right? Maybe a few more fields than what we needed from the top, and then that has a component inside it, and then maybe there are two other components, right? So there's kind of like a bunch of different components that you have. And ideally, what we would like to do at kind of, if you're a large team and we're building this application, we're building it fast, we want developers to be able to collaborate with us, is that we want people to be able to kind of build their components independently, right? And you're seeing that with the rise of better kind of UI frameworks. You have React, and you have a whole kind of component-based UI development, right? That is becoming so popular is because of that ability to kind of reuse and federate and delegate responsibility within your team. What you also want to delegate is that data dependency, right? So that every single component can kind of request for the data that it wants, right? And if you look at kind of the data dependency that this app has, it's kind of like a graph where some things can be fetched in parallel, some things depend on each other, right? But if you're building this manually and you're making a bunch of API calls manually, it's a little bit troublesome to kind of figure out how we should make these API calls, right? Or do you want to block the entire UI till everything happens? Or like how are we going to put this together? What is the pattern that we're going to follow? By the time you start doing this, you'll realize it starts getting very complex. This is not a new problem as well, right? I think one of the latest projects that does this well for non-GraphQL APIs is a project by the Zeit folks called it's a Zeit/SWR, which is a really nice kind of thing that also aims at solving this problem in a non-GraphQL context. But this problem has been around. And GraphQL makes this easy to solve because certain properties of GraphQL that I'll talk about, but GraphQL clients have the ability to kind of compute the dependencies and optimize that data fetch automatically, right? So GraphQL has this property of fragments where you can construct a GraphQL query kind of dynamically, right? And GraphQL clients can make optimizations that realize that, hey, these are two fragments, they're fetching the same data, let's remove some stuff. And let's fetch a lesser amount of data, right? And this maybe doesn't matter for a large number of applications that we build today, especially like enterprise applications, etc. You're like, whatever, it's going to take 2 seconds, it's going to take 2 seconds. But in a lot of cases where you're building like consumer-centric apps, right? You really care about these things. And of course, GraphQL gives us the opportunity to kind of improve and automate some of the caching logic that we have on the client as well. And this is because of GraphQL's property of having things like types. And then you can kind of layer on more abstractions on top and say, we're going to have a globally unique ID for everything, right? Or the way we're going to compose fragments there's going to be a particular way that we compose fragments together. And that kind of really the developer cycles and the months and weeks that you're spending in establishing a common pattern across your team, in building that out, all of that kind of gets absorbed into a product and a tool, which is a great property of GraphQL, right? So all this is good, and because of this, we've seen a lot of implementation of GraphQL. Most of you likely have a GraphQL implementation that kind of looks like this, and this is what seems to be most feasible today for brownfield applications, right? So we're looking at applications where it was very these problems are again not new, right? They've been there for a while, and long ago, in Stone Age, what people used to do is build a backend for front end, right? So they would have an API aggregation layer where you wouldn't muck about with the REST APIs, but you would create this new aggregation layer which would like have that one API call for fetching the profile page that would make 10 API calls and stuff like that. It started turning out that layer was a great fit to kind of introduce GraphQL, right? So that layer kind of started having GraphQL, and people kind of start building that out as their first kind of entry point into GraphQL. This was great because they start providing the maximum amount of benefit to the people who are using GraphQL and the clients that we're building with GraphQL. The challenges that this has, the challenges that we've seen with this approach, or that the community seen with this approach is, it's not a challenge, but I mean, I guess it's a thing that the front-end team largely has to take ownership, right? The big problems in the world today is that humans don't care about each other as much as they should, which kind of manifests itself here as backend developers don't really care about you. They're like, yeah, I built the API, I'm cool, which is bad because now the front-end team has to take up ownership of saying, well, I want a better API, so I'm going to build myself a better API. And so then they go and build the GraphQL, kind of this gateway, right? And they take ownership of that, and they don't affect the functional kind of REST APIs, right? And they remain the way they are. But the front-end team kind of comes in here and takes ownership. So sometimes it's the front-end team that starts off and says, we'll have a GraphQL gateway. Sometimes it's a new team that kind of gets staffed together. If the organization is kind of thinking about the health of their front-end developers and the sanity of their front-end developers, they're like, okay, you know what? Let's put a team together and let's help them kind of make this GraphQL API. One of the ironies of GraphQL has been that today, especially like 2019, 2020, going forward for the next few years, building backend stuff, quote-unquote backend stuff, especially API stuff, has actually become really, really easy, right? With the rise of like serverless and things that kind of help you not do the backendy things, like not worry about concurrency and shared state and scalability and just write some code and it works. It works on my app, it works on the backend, and it's great. But one of the big ironies is that those technologies, that kind of like this cloud-native serverless revolution, doesn't actually work well with GraphQL. So you're not able to kind of build a good GraphQL API if your deployment pattern is just serverless. You need something in the middle that kind of takes care of that for you. And we're seeing a bunch of tools in the ecosystem that are helping you use GraphQL with serverless. But just by itself, it's not that easy. That's kind of just an irony. But anyway, the other kind of challenge here has been that GraphQL clients that can do that kind of optimization and data fetching stuff that I talked about, it does require the GraphQL API to have a slightly more specific property, right? And one of the best examples of that is Relay. So for example, Relay does a tremendous amount of automation and a really good job at handling, that kind of like building a front-end app at scale without having to worry about like the hard problems of data fetching and dependency and optimization, caching and whatnot, and deduplicate. There's a whole ton of problems to unlock there, right? But it does require your API to have a slightly more, a peculiar spec. And that has been a challenge because, I mean, understanding GraphQL and building a GraphQL server is hard enough. Case in point, no hair. But now having to build that for Relay as well is a little more of a challenge, right? And that's another kind of journey that we're going through as an ecosystem as well. So those are kind of like two challenges there. Moving on to the next use case, which is a platform-centric use case, right? So a platform-centric use case is where, I'll talk about the platform. The platform-centric use case is where the API consumers are not necessarily front-end applications, but there are other teams, internal or external, there are teams inside your organization, or there may be developers who are outside the organization as well, right? For example, the GitHub GraphQL API is a good example of a platform API, but for all of you working in enterprise, almost all of your APIs are platform APIs, right? So at the core problem with these APIs has been, and we've seen a generation of amazing tooling that has come up in the last 5-10 years to fix this basic problem that slows down delivery, is that the API onboarding is just slow and painful and broken, and nobody cares about it, right? And people do care about it, but not as much as they should, which is a recurring theme, right? So there are some systemic problems with API onboarding, like authentication and docs, and like the way you document things and the way you document flows. But barring those, the two kind of problems that I want to zoom into that are painful. One is that, especially in enterprise environments, your domain models are numerous, right? Like you have a lot of domain models. You're thinking about the domain models are like a first-class thing that you have to think about, right? If you're in a healthcare organization, you have a patient object and a hospital object and a member or a case record, right? And all of these things are domain models around which the entire thinking of the enterprise kind of revolves around this model, right? And these models are numerous, and these models can't change too much. These models are kind of slow-moving, right? But everything is centered around this model. The way you think about security, the way you think about like who will deliver this, how it's stored, it's kind of all based around this. And one of the problems there is that there are a lot of models, right? And with the platform kind of API, you have a lot of actions and APIs on these models, right? And these are numerous. And I'll talk about what kind of problem comes up and how GraphQL kind of addresses that a little bit, right? So this is the GitHub repository model, right? So if I go to the GitHub REST API, and I'm like, oh, what is this repository object that they speak of? I click on it, and then I kept zooming out. I reached the limit till where the browser zooms out, but I still couldn't get the entire repository model to show up on one screen. And then I zoomed up like one part of the top of the repository model that you're seeing here, right? This is why it's painful, right? If somebody has to use the repository model effectively and understand it, and I mean, GitHub is a kind of different use case where you have developers who are using it and they're used to it and everybody understands what a repository is. But imagine this is an enterprise where this repository thing is not an easy concept to understand, and you need to understand what that concept is, and you have to go through this. You're just going to spend weeks and days kind of understanding what this is and getting productive with it, right? I did a technical survey, and I found out that people have a gazillion fields inside their domain models, which is one problem. And the other problem is that there are a bazillion models as well, right? It's not like this is one model. Like GitHub does not have one repository model. It has like thousands of models, and all of these thousands of models have like thousands of fields. With GraphQL, this kind of goes back to the exploration aspect, but we're not really talking so much about the API integration aspect as much as we're talking about the API exploration aspect here, right? So the ability to kind of like look at what the APIs are and what the types are, and these types are kind of mapping to models, right, becomes really convenient, right? And you can kind of selectively onboard yourself into this concept of what the API is gradually without freaking out. And this is where a lot of amazing work is happening, right? So special shout out to my buddy Sean at OneGraph and the amazing work that they're doing with kind of helping with this kind of onboarding. And especially if you look at like OneGraph's, the Explorer work that they've done and the platform API that they've created that wraps over a bunch of these APIs, things become very easy to kind of understand, right? And it starts showing up that you're reducing weeks and months of understanding with a GraphQL API. The other problem is that it's not just these models, but there are 1,000 different operations possible on each model, right? So again, if you have this concept of repository on GitHub, what all can I do with the repository? So if I have a GraphQL API, right, I ran a schema introspection and I grepped for repository, right? I search for repository and I'm like, okay, I can archive a repository, I can clone a repository, I can create a repository, I can link a repository to a project, I can unarchive it, and okay, these are the bunch of options that I have, right? Whereas if I try to do the same thing with the GitHub REST API, and like, are there REST verbs that I should look at? Like, what is an archive repository REST verb? Is it a put? Like, what is it? It's not a put, but it's a post maybe. Whatever, right? It's something. It's complex. I have to think about it. I don't want to think about it. I want to know what to do with the repository, right? And I tried to find these same methods on the GitHub REST API, and I couldn't because I tried. Like, I just said REST API space archive repository, Control F. I tried a bunch of things on the documentation page. It was hard to find, right? And again, this is GitHub. Imagine if this is your enterprise API. Imagine just the amount of time that you're wasting trying to understand what to do with these API models that you have, right? Cool. How do you get a GraphQL Platform API? You build it. You have two options. You broadly, well, I mean, this is not particularly insightful, but you can either wrap over your REST APIs or whatever APIs you have, or you can build your own GraphQL API. The challenges here are fairly obvious, right? The first is the initial effort of building a GraphQL API on thousands of models is it's a lot of work, right? And do you want to do that work, or do you want to like just invest that amount of effort in telling people to do a better job up front? Like, do better documentation, model it properly, let's fix the way we do our docs, right? And it's hard to decide whether you should invest in building a GraphQL API. The second thing is, and this is a kind of a political problem almost, you're going to be competing with the REST API, right? Because you're not going to be like, oh, I have a GraphQL API today, goodbye REST. No, that doesn't happen, right? And there's a whole set of people, there's a whole set of developers, there's an MD in the org that owns like the fact that I have a REST API. They're not going to give up that REST API, right? And this is a challenge. This is a real challenge, right? And there's a battle that you kind of have to fight, and you have to figure your way around how you're going to do this. I don't have a solution for this. It's an open problem. But one of the biggest problems that this whole thing has is that a lot of the platform API work that is happening has become easy, or has over the decade plus, has become easier because of the tooling that we've had in API governance and management, right? There's a tremendous amount of API governance and management tooling that we have to kind of see what the usage of our APIs are, to secure those APIs, to integrate it with the rule engine and decide who gets access to what, right? Based on an attribute, based on the user, based on the tenant. There's a lot of stuff that's happening there, and none of that exists for GraphQL. Some of it is starting to exist, but it is painful, right? There's a lot of tooling that needs to kind of come together, that vendors need to change to make this part a reality. But the potential benefit that GraphQL can bring because of its kind of properties that it has is huge, but it is going to be a challenge. All right, to quickly talk about the third use case, which is the data-centric use case. And the data-centric use case is very interesting and has started becoming more interesting of late. If you're building something, one of the biggest blockers is access to data, right? This is why databases have been a thing for a really long time, right? And databases will remain a thing forever, which is that, and databases have become really powerful, right? But when you need access to that data, you almost always need to have an API, because especially if you're building modern applications, maybe you're building like front-end apps, or you're building serverless functions or microservices or whatever, databases, for some reason the database industry has decided not to do this, is to not make it convenient to handle the kind of concurrency and security requirements that we application developers have. And so you end up needing this kind of service layer, or the API layer in the middle, that helps you do this work, right? And this is especially common with legacy databases or existing databases, right? Where you don't want to give, like you have a database and there are other people, there are other teams maybe in the org that want to use this data. You don't want to give them direct access to the database because you have no idea who's doing what, right? Who's using what tables, who's using what fields, how many times are they calling this stored procedure? You have no idea, right? And so what you want to do is convert that to an API so that it becomes easier for you to get visibility into what people want, what are they doing, and also kind of create a hedge for you to say, well, here's this kind of abstraction so that you can keep using this kind of stored procedure, but I can change what it does later on. I can evolve my underlying kind of system as my needs evolve. Although the need for that is becoming lesser and lesser, it's still a use case, especially for existing databases, right? And especially as people are kind of doing their whole cloud journey transformation business. There's another problem, which is another problem why you need a data service in the middle, is that modern applications don't speak database very well, right? So two kind of problems there. A lot of the things that we're doing now are stateless HTTP, right? So connect, get something, disconnect, I exist, then I don't exist, serverless function. Or as an application, right, I'm making a few API calls and I don't turn up, and then I turn up 3 days later and I make a bunch more API calls, right? And that's not something that databases do really well. They prefer having long-living relationships, like long-lasting relationships with you, and not having like this ephemeral kind of like, oh, quickly, let's give you data and move on. The second thing is also that and you've seen this over the last few years, is the rise of, when you look at the rise of like document stores and whatnot, is JSON is very important. Everything is JSON. Everything needs to be JSON. And GraphQL as an API deals with JSON upfront, which makes it nice. So, and that's another reason why you need a data service in the middle to kind of do this type mapping, right? Where you're mapping what you have in your data systems to something that an end application developer can understand. GraphQL ends up being a very useful thing here as well, because GraphQL, the Q in it, GraphQL is a query language. So GraphQL makes it possible for us to kind of create what I call a high fidelity abstraction. So on an underlying data source, which basically means that you can kind of extend that query language to create your own domain kind of query language over whatever data sources you have, or a single data source that you have, right? Which is really nice. And this is great because, like I said, GraphQL is all about that JSON. And this is becoming especially relevant today, is because a lot of stuff is becoming data-driven, right? A lot of work is happening behind the database. So we're seeing, like if you're doing MLAI work or whatever, right? You're not doing that synchronously in front of the database. What is happening is that you're doing a lot of work behind the database. Applications and processes are running. They're kind of materializing that data inside a database. And then eventually you want to ship that data out to people and to developers to kind of use that data, get productive with it, make your company billions of dollars, make you some money, hopefully. And that's kind of how that data-driven landscape is evolving, which makes this particularly useful as well. As expected, the problems here are that, once again, building a GraphQL API is not trivial, right? Performance, security concerns, you have to solve them because that's what you were supposed to do at the data service layer anyway. And again, the initial effort is overwhelming for existing data sources. I have thousands of tables, I have thousands of procedures, I have whatever. It's a lot of effort to ramp up. The good news is there's a nice vendor ecosystem that's emerged around this, right? You have, AppSync is a little bit different, but AppSync also does one of these things which helps you map to data sources easily. There's dgraph, which speaks, it's a graph database that speaks GraphQL natively, similar to kind of Fauna, which is not a graph database, but speaks GraphQL natively. Hasura, which helps you create that data service abstraction, solving the security problems and concurrency problems on top of a SQL database, and in the future, as we go along, other databases as well. Mongo recently announced support for a GraphQL interface. They call it MongoDB Stitch, which again does kind of the concurrency and security stuff and gives you access to data, right, which is convenient. What is also interesting is this is starting to happen inside enterprise as well. So LinkedIn had a really nice talk at GraphQL Summit last year where they talked about how they built that internal GraphQL data service that mapped, so they have an internal database, I think that's called Espresso, which speaks a REST API. And which is cumbersome to use, right? And for people to figure out what the access patterns are. And so what they did was they built a GraphQL data service on top that kind of spoke to that underlying custom database that they built, which made life easy for them, right? So that's also starting to happen, which is interesting. All right. So in summary, to wrap these kind of 3 use cases up, GraphQL is It's awesome. It's a good summary. What is also important is that GraphQL is a little bit of a chameleon, which means that GraphQL can do lots of different things depending on what you want it to do and what problems you want to fix. It's a really powerful thing to have that allows you to do like these 3 kinds of things and so many more variations thereof. All of these lines are blurry. These 3 things that I drew so discretely are not actually that discrete. But in a more serious summary, I think what I like about GraphQL the most is that this opportunity to massively improve the interfaces that we have between human beings, which will ultimately impact time to market, is insane, right? Like this is you have technologies that come around that kind of do stuff and say, oh, I made this better and I made that better. But then you have this technology that comes around that kind of just changes the way you're talking about, integrations and APIs, which is amazing, right? And just to kind of look at that again, the kind of different properties of GraphQL, right? The ability to introspect stuff, the idea of having a schema, the idea of having a query language. These are very powerful primitives to kind of do a lot of cool stuff with. As I close this, like Rarushi mentioned before me, would love for all of you to get involved in the ecosystem as much as possible. Talk about your use cases. If you are a largish organization that is using GraphQL, please consider joining the GraphQL Foundation, which is a great way to kind of be involved with the community and put your money where your mouth is. But also, it's also very good for you to be involved with the ecosystem to help other people who are building things to understand what kinds of use cases and what kinds of problems you want to solve, right? And that will help advance tooling. And that is the most important thing for the community so that we can see as many different use cases for this kind of adoption to increase. I'm going to be around over the next 2 days. I'm also around on Twitter and on email. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions whatsoever. I would love to chat. And that's it from me. And I hope you have a fabulous conference. And I hope you get to learn a lot about a lot of the different things that hopefully I set some context for. Thanks, folks.